number of students who have registered who seem to be from schools based in India. However, they don't seem to be of Indian origin. So we are very sorry, but you need to be of Indian origin and studying in schools based in India to be eligible to participate in the IRIS National Fair. You can participate in the IRIS National Fair individually or in a team of 2 students. The junior category is for students of classes 5 to 8, and these students qualify for special awards and Rostcom Masters Awards. In the senior category, you can compete in IRIS and be selected to participate in the International Science and Engineering Fair. One more thing to be noted is students who have completed their class 12 board exams at the time of project submission will not be permitted to participate. So if you have already completed your class 12 board exams, we are sorry, you cannot participate in the IRIS National Fair. In the past, we've had students who have said that they have finished their class 12 board exams, but they are taking a gap year, and so they would wish to participate. Again, we are very sorry, but if you have finished your class 12 board exams, even if you are taking a gap year, you are not permitted to participate. You can be associated with IRIS as volunteers if you are still in your undergraduate courses, or if you're doing a postgraduate course, or if you're just willing to volunteer. Please feel free to be associated to get, so that we can register you as a volunteer for the IRIS National Fair. You can also associate with IRIS as a mentor. You can mentor students who are going to participate in the IRIS National Fair, and you can help them out with their project without really being a participant. You can be a mentor of that participant. You can also collaborate with IRIS if you're part of an organization wherein you would like to get associated with IRIS by offering the facilities that your organization has, maybe lab facilities or infrastructure facilities for camps, etc. If you would like to collaborate, please get in touch with us and send us an email on contact@irisnationalfair.org. Our expert panelist for today is Dr. Suniti Yadav. She is a scientist C in the Division of Non-Communicable Diseases, Indian Council of Medical Research Headquarters. Dr. Yadav has vast experience in molecular biology, molecular anthropology, and bioinformatics. Dr. Yadav has published various papers, including recent work on COVID-19, a comprehensive review of a formidable foe, and the road ahead. We are very pleased to welcome you, Dr. Suniti Yadav, and thank you so much for taking time off to join us in today's webinar. So without further ado, may I welcome Dr. Suniti Yadav.
Thank you very much, ma'am, and thank you, Iris, and thank you, Ishita, for connecting me here with everybody. And I'm really pleased to have this opportunity for me to, guide people and guide students and young minds to take these initiatives ahead, wherein we can actually do science and progress in this area. So, can I start my presentation now?
Yes, welcome, ma'am. Please begin. Thank you.
Okay. So today we would be focusing on the cellular and molecular biology aspect. So since I work in Indian Council of Medical Research, I would be focusing more on the cellular and molecular biology areas that are being targeted by ICMR per se, but then they also cater to other aspects of biotechnology and science and engineering. So in cellular and molecular biology, subcategories are cellular physiology, which includes the nucleus function, the mitochondrial function, the other cellular organelle function, their pathways, their signaling pathways, and the focus molecules. Then coming on to the cellular immunology, as you all know that we have been, facing the COVID threat, and it is a threat to the humanity right now, and everybody is trying to, and it is just a juggle between the immunity of an individual and the single molecule that is just the virus, and which has shaken the entire existence of humanity. So cellular immunology, now everybody knows, it's a very common word among all of us. Then the genetics, which is basically the root of our existence, and we'll be focusing on the projects that would involve genetics in terms of DNA, in terms of epigenetics. Then coming on to molecular biology, the molecular biology would encompass the product of genetics and the transcriptomics, metabolomics, and particularly the neurobiology. I have not really touched on neurology because it itself is a vast area which encompasses cell physiology, immunology, genetics, and molecular biology. So if it would be possible, I would be happy to arrange a small webinar for the neurobiology section. So I would be really pleased for that. So if we start with cell physiology, the studies, we can actually focus on, say, if we start with the cell, so it's a single cellular or the multicellular organism. If we start with that, we can actually cover into this, which we can actually cover the cell cycle, which involves cell division and cellular multiplication. So the processes that involve cell division, cell multiplication in normal mechanisms, as well as the disease mechanisms, therein we can actually investigate projects into these. Say, for example, in cancer, if you have a disease, say cancer, then cellular division and multiplication is at a very faster pace. So the cellular programming is absolutely different in diseases such as cancer. Now coming on to self-signaling. Self-signaling as in each cell communicates with the other cell, or if a cell communicates within itself to cause a disease or to protect us from disease, or in normal mechanisms. So when we say self-signaling, there are pathways based onto it, and we can actually devise projects encompassing cellular signaling mechanisms within the cell or within neighboring cell, or the long duration cell signaling. Say, for example, you pinch your toe and that signal has to pass to your brain. Your brain again has to give back the signal to your toe, that you just have to revert it. So in that case, this is long-term signaling, wherein the signal has to pass through a long channel. So these projects can be envisaged. Then is the molecule transport. Now when the cell signals, it happens through molecules. So within the cell or outside the cell, it has to happen through the molecules. So herein we can actually design projects that understand molecular transport and cell signaling mechanisms. Now it is important to understand different cellular processes in health and disease. Say if you have a particular neurological disease, say Parkinson's disease, there is auto-degeneration of the cells. So why do the cells auto-degenerate there? So if you have cancer at which stage? Cancer at what type of cancer? Is it benign? Benign as in it is not spreading, or is it not benign? It is spreading to the other parts. So each and every disease has important aspect in terms of cellular processes. So whether it takes multiplication, division, signaling, or the transport of molecules. Now, as I have already explained to you, we can also investigate mechanisms of cell signaling in different pathways. First is normal, wherein we do not have any disease, and the other can also be different pathways or diseases. Now, when we have errors in these signaling interactions or the cellular processing or the division, there are phenotypic diseases, phenotypic problems, as in say any of the disease, say ophthalmological disease, cardiological disease, or neurological disease. So disease specific understanding of cell physiology is important. So when we talk of these disease-specific cell signaling, we really need to focus on the molecules that are produced by the cell, that are sent by the cell, or then they have these molecules. These molecules are called the ligands. Then they have the receptors. Say, for example, a molecule has to travel from one cell to another cell, and it has to send a message. So there will be a receptor on the other cell. This particular specific ligand would be binding to the receptor, and then there would be internal signaling in the cell, and then there will be a cellular response. So in that way, we can actually focus our project on the ligand, the receptor, and the pathways. Now, the very, very easy and very important and interesting example here comes in COVID. So why is COVID so harmful to us that its spread is so humongous? So in that case, so if we go by COVID-19, coronavirus has specific structure. This structure, actually binds to the cells and in the receptor cells of human ACE2, wherein it actually duplicates or actually manipulates the shape of the actual ACE2 receptor. So the receptor confuses between the virus, which is actually a foreign particle, and the ligand, ACE2. So it allows the viral entry. So in that case, how the signal is perceived by the receptor, how the receptor allows that particular particle to enter its information inside the cell, and then that signal transduction is there, and there is a cellular response. The cellular response in corona is the virus starts multiplying. The virus uses the host mechanism to multiply. So in that case, this is how we simply understand what kind of pathway we have to understand. So when the coronavirus came, people really didn't know the structure and the functioning of this particular single cell virus. So they started deciphering it, the glycoprotein layer, there's a lipid layer, and then there's a specific change in this. Why? Because coronaviruses were earlier also, but then this is a novel coronavirus because there is some variation in one of its ligand, a very small variation. So this is how this entire thing came up. So it was actually deciphered that there is a small variation in the ligand that causes the change in the entire structure, and the receptor binds to it very strongly. So if I have to start doing it to understand the cell signaling pathways or the receptor binding or all, there's certain approaches to it. So one of the recent approaches that has really come up in scientific area is computation and systems biology. Apart from the normal system, apart from the normal understanding of cell multiplication, we now do it bioinformatically. We use high throughput systems, and then we understand the basic elements of crosstalk between the cell, the complex ligand receptor binding. Any receptor, any ligand which has to bind to a receptor, there has to be a strength of that binding. So in that case, we do it bioinformatically. So signaling network dynamics, which is an important aspect of the recent biology work. Say, for example, if I have a particular disease, or say, for example, I have a particular virus, say coronavirus, it goes inside my body. So what all pathways can it actually affect? Say, if you would have really gone through all the reports or any of the news channels, they would have, initially when we started it off, we could actually see that there were reports that it affects the lungs, it affects the respiratory system. Then came the other reports, it affects the cardiac system. Then reports came, it affects the kidney system, all these systems. So when we talk about this, so we have signaling network dynamics. Say, for example, this virus, when it multiplies, it produces certain cytokines. Cytokines are produced by our body against this virus. So when we have to see the systems that are being affected, we have to see the downstream molecules that are produced and and the pathways in which these molecules lie. Say certain interleukins might be there, which might affect the downstreaming pathways, downstream signaling pathways. So in that way, we can actually cross connect and design different different pathways that can affect the diseases. So this can be done bioinformatically. You don't have to really put an experiment in the laboratory. You just identify a molecule. There are huge databases, very simple to use databases also, that you can actually use and produce a network. Just as in case of in physics that we produce, we can actually produce those networks in biology. So from there, we can actually understand what are our target areas, target organs of a particular disease or a particular virus or a particular molecule. So special applications of computational and systems biology, which is a result of basic cellular function, is pharmacology and then is drug discovery. In pharmacology and pharmacokinetics, we actually, and then drug discovery, we actually use this mechanism, down signaling and up signaling pathways of cells, to continue with the complex mechanisms and molecules to create a network that can actually help in understanding a particular disease. With this particular area, I would really want young minds to be little creative. Say, why not? I mean, if I have a downstream molecule, COVID-19 goes into my body, coronavirus goes into my body, and it causes, inflammation. Inflammation, as in the response of our body against the virus. It produces cytokines, and one of the cytokines is IL-6, interleukin 6. So in that case, what could be the possible pathways of interleukin 6? Where can IL-6 go? What are the binding proteins of IL-6? So in that case, that way we can actually create a network of molecules and understand what are the diseases that are going to be caused by this particular virus. So in that case, we can actually understand the complexities it would cause. If this is one pathological based network creation. Another is disease based. Say if I have diabetes. So in diabetes, I know there is an imbalance of glucagon to glucose. So insulin and glucose imbalance is there. So in that case, I can actually see, okay, insulin is there. What are the downstream pathways of insulin, and what are the downstream pathways of glucose? So that way I can create a network. So if I have diabetes, I can create a network and then understand what all could be the possible downstream diseases. The next is cellular immunology. Now, cellular immunology, now in this era right now that we are seeing every day, that immunology holds an important aspect of all the diseases right now. I mean, anything and everything that is happening is all focused onto cellular immunology, revolving around coronavirus. So in that case, it is not just the coronavirus, all the pathogen-based mechanisms. We can design studies that can investigate the host pathogen mechanisms. Say if you have a disease, tuberculosis, that is caused by the bacterium tuberculosis. So in that we can actually understand the host pathogen mechanism. Why till date we are unable to eradicate tuberculosis? There's a reason for it. Why there's multi-drug resistance in the tuberculosis? Because now when we started treating tuberculosis, so at a certain point of time, clinicians have a problem, or they face a problem that TB has become resistant even to the multiple drugs that they're using. So that way we can actually to understand how this host pathogen mechanism is being changed every day in such a faster pace, where our pathogen is changing, mutating, changing, or adapting to the environment, or adapting to the drugs that we are giving. The next could be studies involving analysis of immune response to cell-based assays. Say, for example, if I have to measure my immune response compared to the other person. So what I'll do, I'll design certain cell-based assays that could be CD3, CD4. I mean, these kind of assays that I can actually measure, or the types of cellular assays that I can measure. This could be done through flow cytometry, and then I can actually design certain projects or design certain studies that could analyze the extent of immune response. The next is to explore the immunological mechanism in innate and adaptive immunity. Innate is the inborn, I mean, that we get already. So, and the adaptive is that we gain through the entire lifetime. So, how is the immune response regulated? Immune response regulated as in when we have a pathogen from outside or an outside foreign molecule inside us. So then that way we can actually, regulate. I mean, how all these are regulated. There are certain mechanisms, the pathways that are there in the immune regulation. We can actually explore them. So in different diseases, different kind of immune mechanisms are activated. If you have tuberculosis, a different pathway of immune mechanism would be activated. If you have any other disease, any other viral disease, any or say influenza, so you will have different mechanisms that would be activated. So we can actually understand which pathway is activated by which pathogen or which foreign material. The another important aspect is immunological imbalance. This balance is immunological balance is very important in carrying out the normal function. So whenever you have a disease, it is generally said there is an immune imbalance. So then when we have these immune imbalances, there comes the condition of a disease, or there is a phenotypic expression of a particular disease, or there are health effects. So this balance between the immunological molecules is important. So when we say immunological molecules, I can say interleukins, I can say cytokines, then I have immunoglobulins. So all these, then we have T cells, then we have B cells, then we have NK cells. So these in the normal scenario, they balance each other. But when we have an imbalance in the expression of these cells or these molecules, there is a condition, there is disease condition. So we can actually try to understand, is there any imbalance in the particular molecule expression in a disease situation or in the normal condition. Can we have next, please? So when we talk about the immune system cells, they're categorized into lymphocytes, T cells, B cells, and natural killer cells, neutrophils, and monocytes or macrophages. And these are type of your white blood cells, that's WBC. So understanding the function and pathways of these cells are important. So you have to be very through with your basic work, the groundwork, when you try to understand the cells of the immune system and the resulting immunological pathways. So when we start talking about the signaling pathways in these immune systems, they're often called cytokines, as I've already told. Then we have the production of antibodies, and we have complement proteins that are support proteins. So we have to understand the basic biology behind all these and be through with it before designing any study or before designing any research question into it. So it is important to have a right question to understand the immunological mechanism. It could be the catastrophe in one particular pathway or in these different types of interlinked cytokines. So that is what is important to be understood in these immunological aspects. Next, please. So when we have innate systems, such as, the signals through which the cells of innate immune system, just as in say dendritic cells, the cells of the brain, and the monocytes, we have to understand how they differentiate, how they become different types of cells, how they proliferate, how they divide and multiply and elongate, and how they survive. If we have an antibody as you must have already listened to it, heard of this, that once you have COVID-19, your system produces, your immune mechanism produces antibodies against it, and which could last from 4 to 6 months, which could. It is still unclear up to how much time would it last. So that way we have to understand how this mechanism develops. So in the same way, when we say have chicken pox, I mean, it's a disease that happens only once in a lifetime. So when it happens, our body produces antibodies against it, and it remains in the memory of the cells, and it creates an immunity against chickenpox for the entire lifetime. So why are certain diseases important in terms of immunological aspects? Why the memory is long term? Why can we not have long term memory for normal cough and cold? So if I decipher it a little, so when I see every season you have influenza or you have viral, so there are different strains of virus that you're exposed to. So when any strain you come across and it multiplies and it invades your immune system, you will have the presentation of a viral fever or viral symptoms. You'll have viral symptoms or you'll have influenza symptoms. So we do not have immunity, a long-term immunity against the those viruses. So in that case, a different strain could be there. So it is not necessary that the same strain is affecting you each and every season that you catch the normal cough and cold. So we can also plan the studies that address how the immune system can protect us. So if I have particular viral infection, what strain it is, what type of bacteria it is, what kind of infection it is, to what extent can it multiply, what is the pathogenicity of that particular virus or that particular bacteria. So that is how we can design our study. So next is to explore the information relevant to designing of new and more effective vaccine strategies. So you have to design vaccines. So how do I design vaccines? So in that case, I need to have an antibody so that I can develop a vaccine. So the studies that are based on nanoparticle vaccine designs, that can also be thought of. So the next is investigate on dysregulation of immune system. So we have autoimmune disorders wherein our own immune system fights against, produces antibodies, and they are not counted as our own. They're counted as the foreign material. So that is autoimmune disorders. As in, arthritis is one of the autoimmune disorders. So, and there are immunodeficiency disorders, certain neurological disorders are there. So that we can actually try to decipher why there is an autoimmune disease, why immunodeficiency diseases are there. Next, please. Now, if I talk on the third aspect of it, that is the genetics, which is the key to almost everything in this world right now. It is all based on genetics, and there are only 4 alphabets of it. That is A, T, G, and C: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. So everything revolves around it. So recently, in past 5 to 10 years, the concept of precision medicine has really come up. So the genetics is actually, it actually unites all of us, and it actually divides all of us. Why it unites all of us is because we have only 4 bases: A, T, G, and C. Why it divides? Because none of us are similar. So why we are not similar? Because the placement of this A, T, G, C in each and every individual is different. So in that case, this is how we differ from each other, because that placement of A, T, G, C is different in all of us. But the genes that are there in the chromosome and the DNA, they are basically the same, but somewhere they differ. So when the place that they somewhere differ is the 5th base. So 5th base is methyl group. In the past 10 years or so, this methyl group has taken up a really important place in the genetic research. So when we talk of genetics, we cannot really ignore the epigenetics. Epigenetics as this is so when we have the epigenetic variation, so when we have genetic variations as in you have changes in your A, T, G, and C. When we have epigenetic variations, we have the placement of epigenetic molecules in different ways. The epigenetic mechanisms involve, say, methylation, which is placement of methyl group. Then there is protein level epigenetic change, and then there is then there are transformational changes in the structure of the particular protein. So in that case, your methylation is the most simplest and the most important aspect of epigenetic process, because it actually governs your cell division, the process that we have already gone through, this cellular physiology, cellular cell cycle, cell physiology, cellular mechanisms, and their immunological responses as well. So when we talk of genetics, it is really important to consider epigenetics in the recent times. So why epigenetics? Epigenetics is something that is hereditary, but that is not seen. I mean, hereditary is something we talk in terms of A, C, G, and C. But epigenetic signatures, epigenetic marks are those that are not seen in every generation, but we can actually see their effect in different generations. See, when we talk of say for example, we have already been, you have been students of science and in school, so you must have said, you must have heard or read about it, that the grandson's nose resembles the grandfather's nose. So why is it so? It is then we say it is hereditary. Hereditary as in say it is your A, T, G, and C. It was placed, and the genes that encode your nose formation, structure, and shape, they are similar. They're similarly hereditary. But then when we talk of genetic heredity, you have 25% chance of resembling your father, because resembling your grandfather, because when we start dividing it, when we have cellular duplication and multiplication, there are 25% chances of getting the same genes. So but then epigenetic mechanisms are something that do not change. They cannot be changed. It is there. The landscape is already there. So why certain and each and every disease or a variation is somehow linked to the epigenetic mechanism. So we can actually design studies that involve genetic variations in ATGC at individual level or the population level. Why the population level? Because there are certain diseases or there are certain situations that are specific to certain populations. I'll give you an example. Say there is a disease, sickle cell anemia. So it is not the normal anemia. You must have already read sickle cell anemia. When there is oxygen deficiency, these red blood cells, RBCs, form a sickle cell shape. So why is it there? It is in the hemoglobin molecule that there is a variation, genetic variation at an individual level, but at an individual level there's a variation, but it is in a certain population only. Why not me? I mean, and when you talk of Indian population, and why was this sickle cell anemia there? Why did this variation occur? This variation, previous slide, please. Why was this sickle cell anemia there? It eventually came as a result of evolution. By evolution, while the evolution was occurring from Neanderthals to modern humans, we were residing in jungles and all. So there were a lot of mosquitoes there. So in human evolution, in the process of adaptation, the sickle cell variation occurred. So a person having sickle cell disease, a person who is the carrier or a carrier, even if the person is a carrier, so the person will not have malaria. So he'll not be having malaria when he has sickle cell. So it arose as an adaptation to our environment. So at population level, when you see, say, for example, the world population or the entire Indian population, you'll have sickle cell pockets. Pockets as in there will be certain areas only where sickle cell would be found, but it would not be found in the general population. So understanding of genetic variation is important to understand the disease or a phenotype at individual level or a population level. So this is how we understand evolutionary aspect of it and the disease aspect of it. Then we have quantitative genetics. Quantitative genetics, as in I understand the gene function. Say, for example, there's a particular gene X. So what exactly the gene X does? Say, for example, gene X ultimately produces a protein Y. That protein Y could be, say, insulin, or that protein Y could be a particular protein that gives me immunological barrier to, say, viral infection or a bacterial infection. So the gene function is important. The gene activity is important. So when the genes are active, they produce mRNA, that is transcription occurs. And then the translation, from mRNA, you have RNA to the protein formation. So that transcription and translation process is important. So when it comes to epigenetic studies, say when I talked of methyl group, the methyl groups are, they attach to the cytosine of the ATGC group. So when we have methyl group attached to C followed by G in your DNA chain, then it is called methylation process. So when you have GC rich regions, there are certain regions that are in our genome that are rich in G and C, G and C, G and C. There are repeats of it. So when we have methyl group, then that particular area forms in the promoter region, in this initial region of any particular gene. If we have methyl groups, that those methyl groups decide whether the gene would function or that gene would not function. So the activity of the gene is decided by this epigenetic mechanism, that is the methyl group. So understanding of this is also important. In the last 5-10 years, epigenetic processes have really taken up the forefront of any disease or any particular area, even in the animal studies or even in the human studies. Say, for example, I have, say, recently we have, in India we have been seeing, or specifically in Delhi, we have been seeing, hearing and seeing cases of air pollution effects. So what does this air pollution does? When we inhale the toxic gases, it causes inflammation in our lung epithelia, and it causes, formation of cytokines. And now these cytokines, travel across the body, and ultimately they interact with our genes. So how do they interact with the genes? The genes that are responsible to fight against those cytokines or reduce the level of those cytokines, they do not get active. Why do they not? Or they become hyperactive. So why do they get active or why do they not? So it all depends on your gene activity, which is ultimately dependent on the methyl groups. So that is one important aspect of it. Now coming on to the gene environment interaction. This is the most applicable, the most feasible, and the most important area of biological research nowadays. So because genes behave differently in different environments. So whether you have a genetic variation or not, whether you have your epigenetic mechanisms are functioning properly or not, but this gene environment interaction is very important, because whatever you are, whatever your health is, or even in animal studies, how the animal is behaving, it is all the environment that is interacting with your genes. So at population level as well as the disease phenotypic level. So you can design the studies in terms of gene environment interactions. A very simple example of it is, say you eat good food. So when you have good nutrition, there are certain molecules in your food that activate the genes. Say if you, for instance, if you have heard of these two important aspects of nutrients, That is, one is folic acid, that is the normal folate, or the iron that you so-called the iron. It's not the iron, but in normal, in common man's language, if I would say I'm eating spinach, I'm eating iron. So, but when you eat, this is actually the folic acid of the folate, vitamin B9. So when we have a sufficient intake of the folate, goes into a particular pathway to get metabolized. So that particular pathway is the one carbon cycle. So when we go to that one carbon cycle, the downstream pathways of it, that becomes that particular folate, a simple molecule that you consume in your diet, is important to regulate the epigenetic mechanisms of your body, because in that one carbon pathway, your methyl groups are released, okay, and there are certain molecules that are produced. So if you do not have sufficient level of folate in your diet, your methyl groups would be altered. Now, the amount of the quantity of methyl groups that are formed, that would be altered. The second is, you'll have certain downstream molecules that would be produced or not produced. There is a particular molecule, say homocysteine, which is responsible for a lot of diseases, as in say cardiological diseases, neurological diseases, then pregnancy complications and all. So this, a single molecule in your diet is interacting with all the diseases, with all the downstream pathways, and causing diseases, or it protects you against it. So this is how you can actually, in your daily science, you can actually gene environment interactions and place a certain study revolving around this. So how the genes are actually interacting with their environment. Then the next aspect of it is molecular biology. Now, encompassing all these is your big molecules. So this is how molecular biology works. Molecular biology encompasses all the big molecules, that is your proteins and that is your RNA as well. The function aspects of it are transcriptomics, proteomics, and metabolomics. When we talk of transcriptomics, we understand the RNA production as well. So RNA production from the DNA. So in animals or in the humans, when we understand transcriptomics, there are a lot of RNA molecules that are produced. Now these RNA molecules have their target molecules. They have to go to a particular area where they have to bind, and then your translation occurs and your protein formation occurs. So transcriptomics, understanding transcriptomics is an important aspect of molecular biology nowadays to understand the disease, so that we actually can understand if a particular microRNA or mRNA is produced less. So can we really come up with supplements, or can we really come up with certain molecules or drugs that can actually enhance or make the levels normal for those particular mRNAs, so that the normal proteins are formed? Now coming on to the proteomics. When we come to proteomics, it is the most simplest yet toughest part of molecular biology. Why the simplest? Easy to identify, and they're easy to measure in normal laboratory. So, but why the toughest? Because a protein is not a protein by the virtue of being a protein. It has certain functional aspects to it. A molecule is produced, but then there are structural variations into it, and then the protein changes, and then finally it becomes it has folding and unfolding, and finally it becomes functional. So understanding of different protein expressions or protein behavior is important to understand the functional aspect of molecular biology. Now coming on to metabolomics, it is not just protein, or it is not just a transcriptome as an mRNA, which is finally governing everything, but it is metabolome as well. Why metabolome? Because these target proteins or the target mRNAs, they ultimately are absorbed into some cycle or some pathway, which produces finally certain metabolites. Now these metabolites, understanding of these metabolites is metabolomics. So why a particular protein was supposed to perform a downstream metabolite X in the quantity of say micrograms, is in 50 micrograms. So that is how metabolomics is important. Now, studies involving system pathways. Now we are now DNA to RNA to protein. It's a complex pathway, and we have to understand why only these particular pathways. I mean, how are these pathways regulated? When we talk of a disease, say if I talk of any cardiac disease, say heart failure, I'll measure a particular protein. So there is a particular protein tyrosine that is enhanced. That the expression of that very high. So I'll measure that protein. But why does that protein is expressed in such a high quantity? So I'll revert back my research. I'll go back to the RNA level. So I measured the RNA. So whether it is low or is it high in its expression. So I'll just measure that. Now, okay, fine, I've measured that, but why is this RNA formed in low quantity or high quantity? I'll go back to my DNA. So that is your reverse research, reverse cycle, and you go back to it. Whereas when you do DNA to RNA to protein, it is largely going into a wild landscape. So when we talk of blue sky research, as in you are deciphering certain areas or sections wherein there is huge opportunity. But as on today, you do not know what all can it hold for future. So when I come from DNA to RNA to protein, so it lies somewhere in blue sky research, wherein I have humongous opportunities, but today, as of now, I do not know what it can hold for future. Now, when we go back from protein to RNA to DNA, it is more focused. I have a protein X. I want to see what was its RNA. So I find the RNA bioinformatically, or I find the source RNA for it. So I measure the source RNA. Then I go back to from where was this RNA produced? So I go back to the DNA. So that is the targeted approach. Now the next aspect revolves around the functional regulation of protein structure and function. So it is an important aspect to understand protein structure, because when we have a protein which is produced by RNA, that is there, but the folding of the protein is important to gain its functionality. That is important. So when we have a protein X which was produced by the RNA, so but the protein X has to bind to certain molecules. That protein has to have its own structure, specific structure. Then only, because ultimately we have so many genes, but we have only very few very few amino acids, but the number of proteins that are formed that are huge in our body. So out of those only 18 to 22 amino acids, we have so many proteins being formed. Why so many proteins are being formed? Because they have structural and functional changes. So it is also important to understand the structural changes and functional changes in the protein. So this can be done bioinformatically. Now we have recently, the bioinformatics area has developed to greater heights because of the tools that we use. So now that we do less of laboratory work, but we do a lot of computational biology or the bioinformatics work prior to switching on to understanding the functionality and structure in laboratory. So we have our systems in place, our bioinformatics in place, and we put certain proteins, we understand the structure, we understand the function. So why a protein X is different from protein Y? That is an important aspect of understanding diseases. So now, understanding genetic variation in intronic and exonic region. Now we all know that our genes have introns and exons. Your introns are non-coding regions, but your exons are the coding regions. Coding regions as in protein coding regions. Intronic regions are not protein coding regions. However, recently we can see a lot of intronic effects on the resulting proteins. Nobody knows, but these intronic variations or intronic regions have said to have an important say in the proteins. So why, where? Nobody, I mean, it has not been deciphered. Nobody knows why. We have already typed intronic variant. I'll give you a classical example of it. Recently, we were conducting a research on hypercardiomyopathy. Hypercardiomyopathy is a disease of the heart wherein your heart enlarges. I mean, if I explain it to you in a layman's language, the heart enlarges. So we understood, took out the DNA from the patient samples, human patient samples, and then we, went in for intronic sequencing and exonic sequencing. So that comes under that, both intronic sequencing, both introns and exons comes under whole genome sequencing. So we sequenced the entire genome. So we found it was the intronic variations that were important in causing that particular disease. So coming after seeing the intronic variation, so what we did was functional validation of it. So we took zebrafish. I mean, you have to validate it in animal models. So it could be mouse, it could be rat, or it could be rabbits, or it could be zebrafishes. So we picked up zebrafish because it is easy to handle, and then you can do your experiments in a faster way than doing it on rats. So we started it on zebrafish. So when we knocked out for that particular variant, for that particular knocked out, as in if you talk in terms of if you try to understand what knockout means you have to remove that particular part of your gene. So that is called knockout. So we can do knockout models in animals. So we knocked out that particular variant in the zebrafish, and we realized that the protein was changing. It was intronic region, but knocking out that intronic variant could result in an effect on the protein. So the zebrafish's heart turned normal. So that was an important aspect of it. So functional validation of the genetic variations to resulting proteins is important in molecular biology. This is how you can actually plan. So when we talk of diseases in humans, you can have certain familial disorders. Familial disorders, as in say, it does not really restrict yourself to the chromosomal diseases, but any of the diseases. Say, for example, if you say diabetes, it's a very classical example of familial disease. A particular person would have diabetes, and it gets passed on to the generations, and you have familial risk. So whenever you go to a doctor, the doctor would really very normally ask you, has anybody else in your family diabetes? So that is how the importance of intronic and exonic variants to the proteins and understanding of molecular biology of a disease is important. Occurs. Then you have bioinformatics. So therein is protein docking and binding. These are two aspects of it. So in terms of bioinformatics, when you talk of bioinformatics, so a particular X is identified, and you have to treat a disease which has say higher levels of protein. So you bioinformatically dock the protein with its target molecule, and you see the affinity. So if you have a drug X and you have to dock a protein Y, so you'll see the binding affinity of it. A very classical study that we did recently was on the pesticides. So that is how you have to be open to your surroundings, first of all, to understand why should I particularly pick up a topic. So pesticides are very commonly used in agriculture in India. So specifically the pesticides that are really not good for human health, and they are used in large quantities. So DDT is very, very normal pesticide, very common pesticide that has been banned in India, but it is still being used in India. So what we really did was, and we tried to connect it to the presence of breast cancer. So we tried to assess the level of those pesticides in the blood in breast cancer cases, breast cancer patients. So when we saw we found the level of DDT to be very high, which has already been banned in India, I mean, as per the laws, but it is still being used. So therein, how can DDT be associated? We were anticipating, I mean, your research never goes as you plan, but it can always take different turns. So we were never expecting DDT to be, the topmost molecule that could be there in the breast cancer patients. So we try to find out what DDT does in breast cancer pathways. So connecting all the point 1, 2, 3, and 4, I mean the cell biology, the cell physiology, the immunology, the genetics, and the molecular biology. So I'm connecting here the all 4. Now, when we started doing the research on it, the DDT molecule actually manipulates the receptor molecule in thyroxine molecule. So it removes the thyroxine molecule and it sits there. So in that case, the entire cycle is disturbed. The entire metabolic cycle of thyroxine is actually changed, and then it leads to breast cancer. And then the molecular mechanisms are changed, and the hormones are changed, and then ultimately it causes breast cancer. So this is how you put bioinformatics in place. So the protein docking and binding, we did bioinformatically. So this is how you can actually proceed with it. So it saves a lot of wet lab work for you, and then it creates a story behind your research. So this is how we can use bioinformatics. So using these studies, we can actually focus on the drug delivery system. Then we can identify drug targets. We can design nanoparticles as protein transport molecules. So say if you have to deliver a cancer drug which has to go to a particular tissue, a cancer drug, say when you start treating cancer, when we go in for chemotherapy, it actually is organ based, but then it affects the entire body. So to deliver in such sophisticated manner, when we have to deliver a particular drug that can go to a particular type of cell and treat the cells there, we need to design nanoparticles. So that is how we design nanoparticles bioinformatically, and then they are used to deliver our drugs and proteins there. So another aspect of it is microRNAs. Recently, of late, in 4 to 5 years, projects on studies on microRNAs are of prime importance in health and disease. Why microRNAs? Because the mRNA, prior to mRNA, your microRNAs are important. So that way, your microRNAs are important to actually see which all pathways are lying, which all areas are being targeted by a particular microRNA, and then the resulting disease in it. So that is how we can actually focus on microRNAs as well. Next, please. Now, considering all these point 1, 2, 3, and 4, before we move on to designing our research and plan our study and conduct it, there are ethical considerations to it. The first and foremost thing is do no harm. Do no harm as in, say, when we start doing human studies or even the animal studies, specifically in human studies, we do not harm the participant. An important aspect of it is using the terms. When we start writing our project, when we actually see the study participants, we actually say they are study subjects or they are study participants or patients. They're always your study participants. So when you plan a study, so nowadays in international forum, if you have the study going on, you most importantly have to have a respect for your study participants. So your study participants need not be harmed during the course of the study. They have all the rights to know the results of the study, what exactly is being conducted in the study. So when you ask your study participants to participate in your study, so you need to have informed consent. That is obviously on humans, for animals you have to go to animal ethics committee. So from humans you need to have informed consent, wherein you put everything in written and you just tell them in their regional languages. It is always in regional languages that you seek an informed consent from the participants. So you need to translate your consent forms into regional languages, and then you actually tell your participants that this is the study, this is what I'll be doing, this is what I'll be all collecting your data on, and then I'll be doing this kind of research. And if needed, the study results can always be disclosed to the study participants. An important aspect of it is the in human studies, the participant has always all the right to withdraw from the study. So you have to inform the person of of all the harms that your study can do. Say if you are doing a clinical trial, if you're doing a clinical trial on human participants of a new drug, say if you see coronavirus, so if we have a vaccine, we'll have a study or a clinical trial on it, and we'll have to seek informed consent from the participants. So we'll have to tell the risks and benefits involved in the study. So you need to have informed consent from the study participants. Then patient information sheet is important. When we do it on patients, you need to have patient information sheet wherein all the data of the patients is being recorded. So that is to be very well designed. The study protocol. Now coming on to the study protocol. Now that you have, if you have designed your research question, you need to standardize your protocol. So study protocol has to be well designed. It has to have all the intricacies that a good study should have. So when you go to an international platform nowadays, or even the national platform, the most important aspect is if you are doing it on human participants or human subjects, if I would say, the most important is your study protocol should be standardized, and it should have informed consent from the participants, and it should be cleared through the institutional ethics committee. Now, biosafety and hazards. This is generally underlooked, but it is still very important aspect of in the ethical considerations, because the bio-waste that you generate during doing your laboratory work and everything, it can cause serious diseases in individuals. Who are directly not involved in the study. So in that case, you need to have the biosafety and hazards in place. You need to dispose of your waste and everything in a proper manner, and you need to know the risks and benefits involved in the entire study. With all these in place, the important aspect that I would say is first of all, you have to identify when you plan your study, you have to identify what it actually is about. If I have to have a research question, it could be any small thing that I can see in my daily life. Why say if I go to a market and if I see the number of individuals that are obese, that are not healthy, apparently healthy, that is increasing. So why is it so? You have to have your eyes open. You have to just be receptive to all the environment and all things that are going around you. So identify what is it. Then you have to generalize it. So can you make some general statements about your research or not? Say if I go to a market, I see a lot of obese people sitting in the shops or in the malls. Then if I go to another place wherein they are again obese, so I would generalize my statement. Say as in, people who are less physically active are generally obese. So then I have to simplify it. Simplify my assumption. So how can you simplify your view by making some assumption of it? So is it because of less physical activity, or is it because of long sitting hours? Next is modeling. So we already have certain models established for it. Models established as a general pattern that is followed in generally all the diseases or any scientific study. So does it already fit an existing pattern, or does it little deviate from the pattern? Say the coronaviruses, that the previous coronaviruses that were there, the SARS and the MERS, they were already there. But then this novel coronavirus, why was it novel? Because it didn't really fit in the already existing pattern. It was novel. So does it fit an existing pattern? You need to ask this question to you. Then you have to rationalize it. Can it exist or not? I mean, my research question, can it really exist or not? So if I say if it is there, it could be there. If I have this answer, if it could be there, can it exist? Can it really be materialized? So then the next thing that you need to ask is whether it is achievable or not, whether I can accomplish the research question. I mean, whether I can answer ultimately it or not through laboratory experiments, or you go to field, or you do population studies, or you go to animal, you do it on cell lines, or you do it on human cell lines, animal cell lines, or whatever. Can it be accomplished or not? Then you have to see the processes. I mean, there comes the pathways. So whether it is a part of something, or it itself is the entire process. So that is how you have to ask it. Then becomes usability. Can it be used? I mean, if I have to quantify the results of my study or the project, so can I use it or not? You have to be, you have to be you have to have little foresightedness to see whether it can be used later on or not. What would be the outcome of the study? You have to be little innovative in that. Now the next is relatability. When we talk of relatability, how is it related to something else? How a particular disease, how a particular phenomenon is related to something else? That is how you interconnect things. Oh, I saw a obese person there. I mean, an obese community there. So they have more of diabetes. So is obesity related to diabetes? So that is how you relate to these. Now the next is sustainability. Now when you talk of the projects nowadays, it really envisages the effect on environment. So that is an important aspect of studies nowadays. When you do animal studies, or when you do say studies that involve your interaction with say air pollution, if you're studying something in air pollution, so or you're doing certain studies that produces a lot of gases or toxic waste. So whether we are actually sustaining our environment or not. So that is an important aspect of studies nowadays that the world looks up to. So the next is availability. So the most important is availability. Where do I do it? Where can it be found? So if I have a research question in place, and if I have to do it, so where do I do it? So whether do I collaborate? Who should mentor me? Who should guide me? And what all resources would I be needing? Whom to approach for the funds? So this is an important question which should come to your mind. Then how to make it feasible? How to make it feasible? How to put it at place? The important thing nowadays is something of a concept called the citizen science. Citizen science, in molecular aspects, it's not really feasible, but when it comes to the behavioral science of populations in terms of disease and everything, which can actually change the molecular mechanisms, the citizen science is important. Say, I'll just give you an example. I gave you an example earlier about the consumption of folate in your diet. So that is something that is citizen science. So you see a particular community or a particular group of people, or in your own family, you see you are consuming less of folate. So which is going to ultimately, just your observation. So you just saw, you observed, and then you applied. So what all could be the possible things that could be affected by this particular molecule? So that is how you convert your citizen science to molecular science. So as you must have known, that science is pursued by those who are creatively adventurous. So you just have to be a little creative. You have to take those risks in science, in cellular and molecular biology aspects. You have to be a little adventurous in that case to get the results. It's generally more of, when we come to cellular and molecular biological research, it is more of blue sky research that you see. The blue sky research is something that cannot give you immediate results, but it holds hope in future. So that is important. So you just have to be little observant, little creative, and little adventurous when it comes to science, and specifically in molecular and biology science. So with that, I would field the question, if any, by the...
Ma'am, I think we'll just have an AV right now. Meanwhile, people who have raised their hand, you can have your questions ready. We'll just take a brief break for an AV, and then we'll come back to the questions.
Sure.
We'll have the IRIS AV now, and then we'll come back for questions.
Are you ready for the ride of your life? Well, it all begins right here. Your first step is picking a category you can enter by yourself or with a partner. If you are in 5th to 8th standard, you will be in junior category. If you are in 9th to 12th, you are in senior category and have a chance of making it all the way to ICEF. Now that you know which category you are in, it is time to find out which subject your project comes under.
At IRIS, you have a variety of 21 subject categories to choose from, ensuring that your project has a category that fits. The categories include animal sciences, behavioral and social sciences, biochemistry, biomedical and health sciences, biomedical engineering, cellular and molecular biology, chemistry, computational biology and bioinformatics, earth and environmental sciences, embedded systems, energy, sustainable materials and design, engineering mechanics, environmental engineering, material sciences, mathematics, microbiology, physics and astronomy, plant sciences, robotics and intelligent machines, system software, and transitional medical sciences.
A display shows the public and the judges what you have done. You're looking to attract and inform visitors about your project. To make it easy for people to access your results by creating a clear, attractive and concise display. The focus should be the work. Take a step.
Your title should be simple and must accurately represent your research.
Take photographs or videos of important parts or phases of your experiment to use in your display.
Prepare a miniature of your model in case your prototype is too large to be carried along.
Make sure your display is logically presented and easy to read.
Use neat, colorful headings, charts, and graphs to present your project. Pay special attention to labeling.
Be sure to adhere to the size limitations and safety rules when preparing your display.
The IRIS journey begins with registration on the website www.irisnationalfair.org with submission of online synopsis and supporting documents. These entries are prejudged by the IRIS Scientific Review Committee, and shortlisted projects are sent an email inviting them to participate in the IRIS National Science Fair. Winners of the IRIS National Science Fair qualify for an intensive series of mentoring camps and get the opportunity to represent India at platforms such as the Regeneron International Science and Engineering Fair in the United States of America. ICEF is the world's largest pre-college STEM competition. Over 265 Indian students have won over 160 awards at this competition, competing with over 6 million high school students from all over the world each year. Not only are you getting a chance to make your nation proud, but if you're lucky, you could join the 31 Indian students who have had minor planets named after them.
So guys, please don't miss this opportunity.
It's your turn now.
If you're innovative and you really want to bring about a change in the world, I think IRIS is the right place for you.
If you enjoy science and math and computer science and so on, so I mean, it gives you a platform to show what you've done, and you have a chance to go to ICF too.
If science actually kindles your curiosity and you're really passionate about it, IRIS provides you the largest platform in India to show your talent.
Applying to IRIS, not only get to have a great experience, you meet great people and great mentors at that. They're not judges, they're not judging you, they're mentoring you, they're teaching you. They make you learn new things.
In the end, it's not about winning or losing, it's about experience, and IRIS National Fair guarantees great experience.
Don't tell people what your dreams are. Show what your dreams are through IRIS.
It's once in a lifetime experience.
It's your turn.
It's your turn. It's your turn.
It's your turn. It's your turn. It's your turn.
It's your turn.
Right, we are now open for questions. And first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Suniti Yadav. That was indeed a very, very exhaustive and a very, very informative presentation. Thank you so much for taking our students through the entire subject category so beautifully. I'm sure all those who have been on this webinar with us today will agree that this is going to be really, really beneficial for the students who would wish to participate in this category. We are now open for questions. So please, if you would like to question our speaker, you could either raise your hand or type your questions in the chat.
We have a participant who has their hand raised. Bijoy Mathur, please ask ma'am your question now.
Good afternoon, Doctor. I'm Bijoy Mathur from KIT International School. To start with, we have what we call a difference of generation. I'm a retired teacher, and to see you bright youngsters there is so wonderful. Now, my question is, in my time, and Sharon ma'am remembers us, you know, the screening committee used to be very strict about the kind of projects we chose. Now, there's been a lot of talk about COVID-19 and things like that. Now, these are highly dangerous pathogens, you know, even to dream of asking a group of students or parents to take part in any kind of activity, even surveys or something, you know, would require a lot of careful decision making. You know, so talking about safety and hazards, now these are second level, you know, P2 level of projects, fairly difficult, you know, even to take a decision. Point number two is about the zebrafish. We had a discussion, we did do some projects, but the screening committee said that you can do experiments up till the zebrafish doesn't develop a backbone, a notochord. That means in 24 hours after the embryo is generated, finish the experiment. So the question is about safety elements, Doctor. Over to you. Thank you.
That's a very nice question, sir, which is actually actually very apt in recent times considering the COVID, because all the research in, if I would say, even in the entire country or the entire world has stopped just because of the COVID. So all the research funds that we were really handling until recently, they've really halted, and we're just waiting for things to normalize. So in that case, certain projects that do not involve one-to-one interaction with people outside, that can be taken up. So if I say say bioinformatics is one, and the other things that if I would say the CAP kind of thing, knowledge, attitude, and practices kind of research these kind of research projects can be taken, which are really needed in this aspect, in this current scenario. Say, if you'll ask me, what kind of project would you really take up in COVID times? If I'm not doing any laboratory work or so. So the most important aspect, if I see in COVID, is the behavioral aspect. So we could have contained the virus, we could have stopped the transmission, but we could not because of the behavior of the people. So that way we can actually take up the CAP study nowadays, or we can take bioinformatics. If we cannot do really, the survey kind of thing, CAPs can be done through the online surveys or online tools. Then the bioinformatics, which do not actually need, and we can actually create good models. Okay, then you can create the designs for certain bioinstruments, or you can actually take up things we can that can tackle the that can actually encompass the molecular part of certain diseases or certain animals. Then coming on to the zebrafish question, zebrafish actually is little used, but it is widely used because it is easy to handle and it is a genome of very small size, so we can actually do research on that. So handling mice and doing the genetic part of it, it is a little cumbersome, but yes, it is effective. Zebrafish we chose because it was easy to handle. We could get results results quickly than we would have done those in rats and mouse. So that was the reason we chose zebrafish. And yes, rightly said, we can do it in up to 24 to 48 hours. So that was it. We can actually choose the models or the animal models based on the utility and the time period that we have to get our results on.
So I would like to add to this here, Mr. Mathur. If you go and read the rules of participation in the international competition, students are not allowed to actually conduct these tests by themselves.
Yes.
They have to be done by an adult, and that adult has to be somebody who is from the lab wherein these tests are being undertaken. So it is only to be done under adult supervision. And when they say adult supervision, what they actually are implying is that it should be trained people who are doing it and not the students themselves. Thank you.
We have Sunita Dikshit who has her hand raised. Sunita, you may now ask ma'am your question.
Good evening. I'm Flight Lieutenant Sunita from Northern Barakanda Road, Delhi. My one kind of a query is that many students have been asking me about how Ayurvedic medicines or the yoga can be helpful in the corona, stoppage of corona, or how we can, they're saying that you do a lot of yoga and you do a lot of breathing exercise, all this. And we are also trying to integrate so many other different type of, subjects to science or microbiology. So I just want to ask you that how Ayurvedic medicine or the yoga can be helping in the corona at the microbiological level, like at the genetical level.
Actually, if I talk about the yogic sciences, recently this Ayurgenomics has recently the field of Ayurgenomics has really come up in the studies. Of late, we also at our institute, we also have been funding such studies, and it has been huge funding, and the government also is really propagating research onto it. And to add to it, if you ask me how yoga is actually beneficial in this disease, it will. I mean, I'm really not a yoga person, but then just I mean, it clears your airway passage properly, and then it regulates your immunological mechanism. So that is one important aspect of it. And if you talk of Ayurvedic medicines, I'll just share with you the preliminary results that one of the one of the researchers team was doing. They picked up somewhere around 2,000 molecules. The Ayurvedic molecules they picked up, and they tried to dock it with the viral molecule, the virus. And out of those 2,000, only 20 of them. So you can calculate the percentage of the precision there was there. Only 20 of them could clear and bind with the virus molecule. So out of 2,000 molecules that we have, only 20 could clear. And out of those 20, there were only 4 that could clear the toxicity level, the toxicity threshold. So we cannot really say right now how much these Ayurvedic products would be beneficial in controlling the COVID. But yes, they might be helpful if we do research into it, and if somebody comes up with any of the molecules that can actually tackle COVID.
Thank you, ma'am.
So Flight Lieutenant Sunita Dikshit, I think you can take this up as a challenge for your students. That would be really great, and we'd love to see a project on this for the IRIS Fair. Thank you.
This would be something which is very specific to India, and of course people across the world are looking up to this yogic sciences and genomics and Ayurvedic. So that can be really an important project in the coming times. Therein you can actually take it cellular level, molecular level, and you can do it bioinformatically. This is what people are doing bioinformatically. I mean, that's just an example that I gave you. So you can pick up molecules based on the experts' suggestions, or who are experts in Ayurveda. They can suggest you that the molecules, and then you can take it accordingly.
There is a question in the chat from Rubika Shri. She asks, if we write a comprehensive paper on the literature review summarizing existing researches and point out certain pattern or applicable solution, can that be considered for this year's IRIS National Fair?
So I think I'll take this question. Ms. Rubika Shri, one of the mandates for the IRIS National Fair is that the research has to be it has to be an original innovation. Therefore, if you bring something that is kind of curated or collected from elsewhere and put it across as just a paper, I don't think that would be very acceptable. However, if there is some kind of research which is started based on what is already available, that would probably be considered.
We have Rupsha Sengupta, I beg your pardon, who has her hand raised. I will now unmute you and you can ask ma'am your question.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Rupsha Rupsai. Am I audible?
Yes, Rupsha, you're audible.
Now my question was that I had read one article saying it goes like one we have one classification of drugs called opioids. So opioids are some kind of drugs, some category of drugs which are harmful at certain level, but they are of great medical use. So how can we reduce the availability of these opioids in a larger amount in the public? This is my first question. And the second question is how can we determine the quantity of that drug which are being given to the patient?
If I got your question right, you're talking about legalizing the amount and quantity of drugs, I mean, in terms of opioids to the general public. So in that case, we have certain regulatory bodies that actually legalize the quantity and the drug dosage in the market. So that is the director control, the DCGI. So DCGI actually sees if a particular opioid or any kind of, say, substance that is abusive can be used as a drug or not. So they are the ones who actually legalize the quantity and the volume of the drug that is to be used in the medical areas. So as per the regulatory bodies are concerned, there are very few and they only have to be approached for this.
We have Miss Vibha Jain who has raised her hand. Vibha, I will unmute you and you may ask ma'am your question.
Hello. Vibha, you're not audible, it seems.
Vibha, if you have a question for ma'am, please ask ma'am the question. Okay, meanwhile, we have a question in the chat. This is from Praveena Navalur, who asks, I have done many research with virus RNA. Normally, RNA is easily degradable in the normal temperature. If COVID-19 virus is having RNA, then how is it surviving the outside normal environment for a long time? Is it because of its genetic modifications?
See, when you talk of the viruses are RNA based and they have a tough layer, capsid layer outside the RNA layer. So that is how they survive. It is not. It is the normal RNA that gets degraded even in the room temperature. So when I extract RNA from the blood and keep it outside in room temperature, it would degrade. But the viruses, that is why viruses are the toughest surviving or the non-surviving organisms in the world, because they have a tough capsid layer outside them. So that is how they survive and sustain in the toughest of the environment. It is not because of genetic mutation. COVID-19 is called, it's called the novel coronavirus because it has a genetic mutation in one of the spike proteins. So that is why it is called the novel coronavirus.
There is another question in the chat, ma'am, from Rupsha again. She asks, how do doctors decide the quantity of certain harmful drugs given to the patient, as testing it on some animal may cause harm?
Rupsha, we have certain procedures for coming up with the regulatory quantities of the drugs. So first of all, it is on animals, and then it is controlled. It is controlled and controlled human trials are done through, on which very small quantities are given to the patients or the individuals, and then then it is it is seen whether they have any visible side effects or not. That is how the quantity of drugs are regularized. So it has to be done on animals first, and then it is done on humans. As human trials, as a part of human trials. Any visible side effects, or even on animals or humans, it has to be reported to the ethics committee. As I talked about the ethical considerations there, any of these side effects, they are to be reported to the institutional ethics committee, which decides whether the trial has to be stopped or not. So if they see any visible side effects, say for example the death of an individual or life-threatening situation in an individual, so they'll stop the trial, and obviously the drug dose has to be reduced. So that is how it is to be, it is regularized.
The next question is coming in from Rubika Shri. She asks, are studies involving catabolic pathway studies possible without much funding?
If you'll ask me, these studies require a lot of funding. But then if you have the zeal to conduct a study, funding is never an issue first. Second is funds can be gathered from anywhere. Obviously, no funding. If you have a good research question and a research proposal, no funding agency would refuse funds to you. The second thing is about the catabolic studies is if you start your preliminary work, or if you do a background work with good literature and have a focused research question that targets a particular thing or a particular molecule or a particular pathway, it reduces the cost. So if you go in for, say, there are two kinds of research, technology-driven research and your hypothesis-driven research. If you go for technology-driven research, you will have, say, if you go in for, say, sequencing, which is a whole genome sequencing or whole exon sequencing, it is technology-driven research, wherein we sequence the entire genome and we try to find a variant there, and then we go back to the variant, then the ultimate protein of it. So, and if I go with the hypothesis-driven research, wherein I have given you an example. So if I eat less of folate, I'll have these pathways that would be affected, and I'll have these metabolites that would be affected. So I specifically measure those metabolites, and I know the ultimately the causal molecule of it. So that is how I design, whether I have to go in for technology-driven research or say hypothesis-driven research. So to me, hypothesis-driven research has always been better, but technology-based research has always given good results also. So that way you can reduce your money input by doing some preliminary work through biostatistics and having literature surveys well in place.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Sunidhi. I think we've gone way beyond the time of this webinar because it has been so interesting. Thank you so very much. Any other questions that you may have? Send them email and direct it to our panel. We will have and on the best evening. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please do follow our social media forms. And if you have back to us on much once again.